What would you do if you knew that a betrayal within your own family changed the course of one of the most important lineages in history? The scandal involving Tamar is one of those stories that makes us rethink justice, lust, and the destructive power of silence. This is not just a biblical story. It is a tale of unbridled desire, deep betrayal, and the consequences of reckless decisions. Often, we ignore the impact of our actions, but like David, your choices can trigger a cycle of pain and revenge that affects far more than the one who made the first mistake. Want to know how it all began and how it could have been avoided? What's coming might completely change your perspective on justice and redemption. From the moment David gave in to temptation with Bathsheba, his family began to carry a heavy burden. The prophet Nathan had already made it clear the consequences would be profound. And that's what happened. Adultery and manipulation resulted in a cycle of intrigue, betrayal, and violence within his own house. This family conflict is not so distant from what we see today, when unresolved mistakes multiply within family dynamics. What could have been done to prevent it? Maybe a different decision at the beginning of the path. However, the shadow of David's mistake didn't stop there. What began as a slip with Bathsheba became a kind of curse that directly affected his children. It's not uncommon that when leaders fail, their failures echo for generations, as if every family member is doomed to follow a path of destruction. David, the strong king, found himself powerless before his own children, who did not know how to deal with their desires. Nathan's prophecy was clear: the sword would never depart from his house. This foreshadowing of conflict makes us deeply reflect on the importance of the choices we make, especially when we have people depending on us. The impact of a wrong decision can reverberate over time and in the lives of our descendants. In David's life, this became evident. Perhaps, if he had repented and acted more decisively from the start, his family's story would have been different. But as we already know, the tragedy was just beginning. Amnon, David's son, let himself be consumed by a sick passion for his half-sister Tamar. It's interesting how uncontrolled desire can turn into obsession, blinding reason. Amnon, influenced by his impulses, completely lost sight of right and wrong. He stopped seeing Tamar as a person, reducing her to an object of his desire. This shows how dangerous it is not to tame our feelings, allowing them to control us to the point of forgetting the humanity of others. And, as always, there are those around us who, instead of guiding us towards good, fuel bad intentions. Jonadab, a cunning advisor, saw Amnon's obsession as an opportunity. Instead of warning him, he devised a plan for Amnon to deceive Tamar. What should have been a moment of intervention and reassessment became a web of manipulations. This kind of negative influence is common in various situations in our lives, and it is essential to identify who is truly on our side for good. Obsession, when uncontrolled, can have disastrous consequences. In Amnon's case, the desire for Tamar grew so much that he saw no other way but to act on it, in a vile and cowardly manner. Many of us have seen examples of this around us, when a person lets themselves be consumed by an idea or feeling and, not knowing how to deal with it, ends up acting in a way that harms others and themselves. Amnon's story teaches us that without control, our desires can destroy us. And here we begin to see the path to the betrayal that was to come. Amnon's betrayal of Tamar was a brutal act that marked the lives of everyone involved. Pretending to be ill, he asked Tamar to come and care for him, in what seemed like an innocent gesture. However, behind this apparent fragility lay a dark intention. Tamar, trusting her brother, would never have imagined that she was walking into a trap. Her trust was cruelly broken, and this serves as a reminder of how close people can sometimes negatively surprise us. The moment Amnon ignored Tamar's pleas is one of the most disturbing parts of the story. She begged, tried to convince him not to commit such dishonor, but Amnon was determined. The abuse Tamar suffered was not only physical but also a violation of her dignity and the trust she had in her family. For Tamar, the consequences were devastating. At that time, her dishonor practically meant the end of her chances for a dignified life in society, something that makes us reflect on how victims of violence often suffer the most consequences. And what about the impact of this betrayal on the family? Tamar, devastated, had nowhere to run. As for Amnon, even knowing the gravity of what he had done, he acted coldly. This not only shattered Tamar but also planted the seeds for Absalom's revenge. After all, how can a family recover from such a deep wound? A betrayal of this magnitude would never be forgotten, and what followed was just the beginning of a spiral of revenge and pain. While Tamar dealt with shame and pain, Absalom, her brother, was watching everything with a silence that hid deep hatred. He took her in, offering words of comfort, but inside, a storm of revenge was brewing. Absalom's silence was much more than mere acceptance of the facts. He was planning. Sometimes, it is precisely the silence that precedes the greatest actions, and in Absalom's case, this would be no different. He knew he couldn't let Amnon's crime go unpunished. This kind of contained anger is dangerous, not just for the one who carries it, but for everyone around. Absalom didn't confront Amnon immediately, nor did he even discuss the incident with his father, David. Instead, he let the resentment grow in his heart. For 2 years, he waited patiently for his opportunity. This kind of planned revenge, calculated at the right time, is something we see in many stories, where patience is often the most lethal weapon. Absalom's ability to disguise his anger is something that surprises. He carried on with his activities as if nothing had happened, giving no hint of his real feelings. This kind of behavior teaches us that often the greatest threats are not those who shout, but those who wait in silence, observing and calculating their next steps. When Absalom finally decided to act, everyone around him was caught off guard, showing that the consequences of an act of violence rarely go unanswered. After 2 long years, Absalom's revenge finally took shape. He organized a great banquet, inviting all the king's sons, including Amnon. The stage was set, and Absalom's patience would be rewarded with his brother's death. In the middle of the festivities, while Amnon was carefree and vulnerable, Absalom gave the order for his servants to kill him. It was a cold, calculated blow, executed with precision, demonstrating how Absalom's revenge had matured over time. This type of revenge, though satisfying for Absalom at the moment, brought more tragedy. Amnon's death was the beginning of a cycle of violence that would continue to haunt David's family. Revenge rarely solves the original problem. Instead, it tends to perpetuate suffering. By eliminating Amnon, Absalom didn't bring relief to Tamar's pain or restore the honor she had lost. Instead, he only multiplied the pain within David's house. Many of us have seen or even experienced something similar, where revenge doesn't erase the past but deepens the wounds. When Absalom killed Amnon, he also sealed his own fate. Despite his justified hatred, his decision to kill was a solitary crusade, without the support of his father or anyone else. This act of rebellion distanced him even further from David, creating an irreparable rupture. Revenge, after all, is a double-edged sword, and Absalom would soon discover that by killing his brother, he also paved the way for his own downfall. And so, the cycle of violence continued to spin, with more blood being spilled in David's house. David, though filled with rage over the violence committed by Amnon, remained strangely passive. The great king, who had once shown so much vigor, found himself paralyzed. Perhaps it was his guilt for his own sinful past, or maybe he feared further destabilizing the family. Either way, David's inaction was a fatal mistake. His silence and lack of action only amplified the sense of injustice, both in Tamar and in Absalom. How many times, by not acting, do we allow problems to grow even more? What's interesting is that by not punishing Amnon, David not only failed as a king but also as a father. His hesitation in dealing with his aggressive son created a sense of impunity. Perhaps he was trying to avoid more conflict, but his lack of action ended up contributing to the escalation of problems. It's a clear example of how leadership, or the lack thereof, can profoundly impact a family or a nation. When leaders don't make difficult decisions, pain and chaos tend to spread. In the end, David's inaction not only worsened the immediate situation but also laid the groundwork for the collapse of his own authority. How could he expect Absalom to stand by in the face of Amnon's impunity? The lack of a just response made Absalom feel compelled to act on his own. This is the great danger of not facing problems head-on. they come back, stronger and more destructive. And so, the tragedy continued to unfold, dragging David's family further into the abyss. In David's house, sin seemed to repeat in an endless cycle. What began with David's adultery triggered a series of events that turned his family's life into a true nightmare. Each act of betrayal, each dishonor, seemed to only fuel the next mistake. Amnon sinned against Tamar, Absalom sinned against Amnon, and so on. The cycle of revenge and sin was inevitable, as if each family member was trapped in a tragic fate. It's not hard to see the same pattern in the lives of many people who repeat the mistakes of their parents. What makes it all more tragic is that David, the great king, found himself powerless to break this cycle. His own moral failure had opened the doors to disorder in his home, and now, he could only watch as his children followed destructive paths. Leadership failed not only on the throne but also within the home. We see this kind of cycle in many aspects of life. Unresolved mistakes, untreated traumas, all tend to repeat unless there is a conscious intervention. And in David's case, that intervention never came. The cycle of sin and revenge that took over David's house is a powerful reminder of how our mistakes can echo through generations. The lack of forgiveness, the absence of justice, and the desire for revenge only perpetuate the pain. Absalom, in seeking revenge for Tamar, ended up sealing his own fate and feeding even more into the tragedy to come. Just as in the past, when sin is not faced, it continues to corrode and destroy. And, of course, the end of this story of pain and suffering was still to come. So, after delving into this tragic story of Tamar, Amnon, and Absalom, the question remains, what would you do in a situation of such injustice? Would you stay silent like David, or seek revenge like Absalom? The great lesson here is that in our lives, often the deepest wounds come from those closest to us. And what we do with that pain can define the future, both ours and those around us. Now think a little. Where are your unhealed wounds, and how can you break the cycles of pain that repeat? If this reflection moved you, don't miss the chance to keep learning. Subscribe to the channel, activate notifications, and come discover more stories and lessons that can change your life. After all, knowledge is the key to transforming even the most difficult chapters of our story.